I was trying to talk Mark into taking this sermon, and I suggested that I would take his place singing if he takes my place preaching. We thought we'd send you home with laughter this morning. How are y'all doing today? Good. It's good to be in the house of the Lord on this last Sunday of the year. I'm going to ask you to pull out your bulletin. On the middle panel in the back, we haven't had time to go through all those surveys yet, but a couple of things we found out was, number one, people don't like electronic giving. I was surprised at that. But I have a couple of roles here. One is spiritual leadership. The other is leadership of the functioning church. And since that survey, we've had 2 bad weather Sundays. And here's a fact. Electronic giving, you don't lose those Sundays. We give when we're here, and that's difficult. And so it's difficult to make the church function. But I got that message. Second one was, actually people seem to like book studies. I didn't know if I was forcing something that you didn't like, but I got that message. And so on that center panel on the back page, I have looked for a book, Buried Fruit, Ministry with Real Results. And it was, I want to say it was really difficult this time. I was looking for a book that met some criteria. One, I wanted to have something to it. I wanted to have some beef, some meat. Why read a book that is useless? And so I read a lot of books and read through them and considered them. This one has some meat to it. The second criteria was I was looking for a book that cost about $5. I failed there. You can't get a book with something really, really important in it that costs $5. The last one you paid $5 for, Karen and I gave a certain amount so that the actual price of the book was down to $5. This book costs $15 if you buy it new. And I figured that wouldn't happen. Thirdly, I decided, since we're talking about personal responsibility and we're talking about spiritual development, that I wasn't going to buy the books. That you can go on Amazon.com, and I did this. Are you proud of me? I did. I went on Amazon.com to see if they had the books, and I still don't understand the thing fully. I don't, because it said they had 100 books. And when you start looking at it more clearly, there's 100 books, but you can't buy 100 books. You know what I mean? You have to buy them like one at a time. Do you understand that? I don't quite understand that one. But here's the good news. If you go on Amazon.com, you can pick this book up, a used version, for $1.60. Okay? Come on. This is, you know what, all of you, you know what, you celebrate a little hard for Christmas. All the services, I think, today. Are you guys recovering from Christmas? Okay, I'll give that one to you. $1.60. And it's a worthwhile book. Also, it's written a little bit more for clergy, but as I read that, I realized that the truth is this. Every one of us are called to be a Christian leader. I think that's what we haven't held ourselves to. Every one of us, every Christian is to be a Christian leader when you're out in the community. Every one of us. Every one of us is to have a fruitful ministry, called to. And so I'm going to ask you to consider getting it. You'll have to go get it, though. You can download it. You can get it electronically. For some reason, it's still about $15, I think, electronically, but you can get it that way as well. I encourage you to do that. This will address an issue that has been pointed out by greater minds than me within the Christian community, not outside the Christian community looking at us, blaming us, but within the Christian community, who are saying things like, we've been fairly good at growing the church a mile wide, but we've only grown it an inch deep. It's speaking to a lack of spiritual growth, growing deep in the Lord, so that we can, as the Bible says, be ye holy like God in heaven is holy. And we haven't given enough attention to that, but here is the issue for me, because I have struggled with this, and I've come to terms with it finally. I cannot grow you deep. Okay? I can't do it. I can yell, I can scream, I can do all kinds of things. As a spiritual leader, I can't do anything. I can't do that. Each individual must make that decision. Spiritual development, the deeper we grow in the Lord, is a personal thing. It's a decision. I want to be holy like my Father in heaven is holy. And so I'm challenging you to consider that and to understand that I can point. I'm going to do my job. That's what this book's for. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to keep pointing. I'm going to point it to water. I'm going to point at that water the Bible says that is God's refreshing water that bubbles up out of the land. I'm going to keep pointing at the water where the trees grow beside it and the roots reach down into that water and are refreshed by Almighty God. I'm going to keep pointing. You have to decide whether I'm going to go deeper. And we're going to take a look at that. I encourage you to get that as we go forward. And part of that, I'm going to begin today. Don't hate me for today. But I'm going to try to do what it means. I'm going to try to show all of us what it means to not be ignorant of our text. Because that is a massive criticism of the Church of Jesus Christ is that most Christians don't know our text. What we know is we know stories that have been told us. We know our tradition. We know the neat little things that we believe in, but we don't know the text. And so when we're just pushed a little bit by the world, we fail. We clam up, we move away, because the world, interestingly enough, seems to be more adept at looking at our text and pointing out what looks like inconsistencies, and we are not very good at pointing out how they're not inconsistencies, how we are given the truth of the message. And I want to talk about that this morning as we look at, first of all, I'm going to draw your attention not to the screen, but to our nativity. Do you remember the first Sunday of Advent where I pointed out the nativity and I said something like, you don't see John the Baptist over there? Does anybody remember that? Good. I did say that. You don't see John the Baptist. Nobody puts John the Baptist in the nativity. That we don't like John the Baptist at the nativity. We don't like John the Baptist because John the Baptist was understood to, even then and understood today, to be the last of the great Old Testament prophets. And we don't like John the Baptist there because John the Baptist didn't come with a nice little story about birth and all. John the Baptist came talking with a message that was fire and brimstone, and the axe is at the root, and bad things are in store unless you repent. Repent is his message. And we don't like that because the prophets, if you look at them, the prophets were a conscience to the people. And history tells us that none of the prophets, the true prophets of God, were appreciated much in their own time. They weren't appreciated much in their own time because they were the conscience. Because when the people got feeling rather good about themselves, rather self-righteous, they were living the right life, they were doing what God wanted them to do, they were doing everything, the prophet would come along and say, you know what? God's really not pleased. God's not pleased because the issue is not about are you worshiping right? It really isn't. It isn't whether you come to the temple all the time and do the right thing. It is whether you are right with God in your heart. It is whether you have confessed before God. It's the prophet says what God requires is not the sacrifices, but a contrite heart, a heart that God can work with, a heart that God can meld, a heart that God can move and grow, and you're a hard-hearted and stiff-necked people. That's the message of the Old Testament prophet. How many of you want to be preached to that way today? Put up your hand. I'll pull you aside because most people don't want it. And so we don't want John the Baptist at our manger scene, even though he would be appropriate. He is a cousin of Jesus. 6 months old. Jesus is a baby. There should be a baby in arms in the nativity, and it would be John the Baptist, and that would be appropriate. I thought about that, and the image that came to mind was, I love Charlie Brown, Charlie Brown's Christmas. And I love the Halloween one too, the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. And so we have the disc. We'll watch Charlie Brown Christmas every year, but I'm pretty bad. I'm kind of addicted. So if I see that it's coming on general TV, I will sit and watch that and watch the commercials again as well. How many of you do that? Anybody do that? There we are. You know, I noticed the brightest people in here do that. Right? That's right. And I love this. I love it. It's the thing that as the season approaches that I look for. And it's that finally gets the things flowing in me, I guess the juices. But there's a scene where Charlie Brown, he doesn't get Christmas. Lucy comes up to him, says, you need purpose, we need a director. You know the scene, I've seen it a lot. Come on down, lead our play. And so Charlie Brown, he gets down there and he's trying to lead the play, but the kids they start dancing, and Lucy wants to be the Christmas queen, Christmas pageant queen, or something like that. At any rate. And Charlie Brown's trying to hold them together. He can't get it together, and finally he holds his head. He just kind of flips his head down like that, and he says, it's all wrong. That could be said about our nativity. It's all wrong. Because John the Baptist isn't there. He should be. And the wise men are there, and they shouldn't be. And it seems like it's all wrong. Furthermore, that echoes modern scholarship. At the very best, they show up 2 years after the birth of Jesus. Now, we should know that by now. But we don't really know our text, because the text tells us. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where's the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen, when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. May God add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. Amen. So as we take a look at this text and our understanding of the Nativity, it all seems wrong. Now, I want you to hang in there with me for a minute. Don't want anybody going out of here saying, I don't believe in the Bible. I believe in the Bible profoundly. But I believe in the Bible not through closed eyes, but I believe in the Bible through the studied eyes of faith, where God has led me and directed me and has grown me to understand that sometimes story wipes out message. And we have a wonderful story, but I think we have lost the message of what was intended to be said to us. And so we make it say what we want rather than to listen to what the Bible wants us to understand. And the first of that is this. What's all wrong about it is that they were not at the birth. How many of you know that? How many of you heard that? Okay, we got some. They were not at the nativity, not at the birth scene. As we look into the text and look carefully in the text later on tells us that in order for Herod to figure out who the king is, he kills all the babies below 2 years old and below. It tells us, and here it tells us, that they had seen the star prior and they have been traveling. It's 2 years, kids 2 years and older, that they show up 2 years after. And the text furthermore tells us, Luke tells us they're in a stable. But this text tells us they're not in a stable, they're in a house. By now they are living in a house 2 years after. So they don't belong at the nativity. They belong at some time later. We just kind of have conjured that up in our minds. Secondly, they are not kings. Where do we get the notion that they are kings? Somebody tell me. Yell it out. The song. What song? Sing it for me, Jim. I'll sing it with you, duet. How does it go? We three kings from Orient are traveling. I got it every time until now. We three kings, Orient are. Bearing gifts. Somebody's helping me. Bearing gifts. We travel afar. We know that, right? We know the song. The problem is, and this is evidence of what we talk about when we talk about eisegesis or talking about reading into the text. What has happened is this wonderful, and I love the song. This wonderful song about we three kings has in fact become so much a part of our psyche that we read into the text that three kings from the Orient have showed up there. They are not kings. The text tells us who they are. And furthermore, we call them wise men. They are not wise men from Israel's tradition. Israel has a wonderful and rich tradition called a wisdom tradition, the sage of the wisdom tradition. Israel has a marvelous history of the wise sage and the speakings of the wise sage. The primary document there would be to go back and look at Proverbs, and we see the wisdom tradition of Israel. They are not wise men from the tradition of Israel. The text tells us who they are. Who are they? They are magi. And who are the magi? They are priests. The text tells us this. Why don't we know it? They are magi, which means they are priests from an Eastern religion, the Zoroastrians. Who are the Zoroastrians? They come out of the ancient Eastern religion where they believe that the stars can predict the future. And why it seems all wrong is if you know Israel's tradition, you know that in the Old Testament, Israel is particularly, the people of God are particularly, specifically, interestingly enough, told not to look to the stars to try to read the future. That you are people of the divine God. You don't look to the stars. To do that is idolatry. To do that is to put something in front of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. You don't look to the stars for anything. You look to the divine God. And yet they show up at this scene. It is also not stipulated that there are three. Why do we say there are three? Because there are three gifts. And so we assume into the text. This is bad Bible study, okay? And this is what often we do. We assume into the text, and we don't even read it carefully enough to know we have assumed it into the text, that it doesn't tell us there are three. And we know from looking at that time frame, we know that how people traveled, because it was terribly dangerous. Three people wouldn't have traveled that kind of distance. They would have had a caravan. They would have had armed people. And it is more than likely that if such a thing happened, there would have been a caravan that would have numbered in the hundreds in order to carry and protect these kinds of gifts that are brought. So we have believed that there are three, and yet the text doesn't tell us that. This one's a very important one. There is absolutely no record. If you read this story a little bit further, you know, the wise men, or the Magi, see that? The Magi don't return to Herod. Herod decides to kill all the children in Bethlehem 2 years and younger. There is absolutely no record or hint of a record of that. There is nothing in Rome, in Roman history. There is nothing in the history of Jerusalem. There is nothing most importantly, there is no emotional memory that was shared with the common people in and around Bethlehem. None of that comes down to us. Now, I want to be clear. I know in archaeological studies, sometimes they find something that the Bible said was there, that history said was not. I want you to know, I know what I'm talking about, but this kind of story wouldn't have disappeared. As someone pointed out to me today, Dave, I don't see him, Dave pointed out to me today that at the very least, Josephus would have included this story. Josephus, who writes about all that went on prior to the Jerusalem wars and includes things about Christ, that there is no hint of it. Paul doesn't know of it. John doesn't care about it. Luke is the biggest critic, however. Luke, if you go to Luke says, essentially, something like this, "O Theophilus." So he's writing to, "O Theophilus." He's a medical doctor. He knows research technique. He says, "I have decided to carefully research the things about Jesus and put them down into print." And Luke doesn't know anything at all about the stuff that Matthew has listed there. And so it seems all wrong. But I submit to you, the message is completely true. Now, how can that be? If the story is all wrong, according to the broader testimony, how can it be true, completely true at the same time? That's because we're not taught well. That's because we don't know that Matthew is telling this story for a very particular reason. And the reason is this. The reason is Matthew is telling this story just about 8 years to 10 years. The cutest thing I've ever seen is my grandson out there carrying a ball. I'm sorry. Matthew is telling a story about 8 years after the Roman legions destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And the reason that's a critical event to understand Matthew is this. Up until just about 2 years before Matthew is written, Judaism and Christianity, or at that time, this is biblical, you find it in the Bible. I'm not making this up. This is in the Bible, but you have to read carefully. Is that Judaism and Christianity, people of the way, worshiped in the synagogue together. For the first 80 years or so, from the point, not 80 years, For the first 50 years, from Christ to the destruction of the temple, Christianity, people of the way, people of the Hodas, and Judaism worshiped in the synagogue together. People of the way were considered a sect of Judaism. They were Jews. At this point, they're still Jews. At this point, it's still a very small group of people, and they're all Jews, Gentile here and there, but they're almost all Jews. And what has happened then is the Romans come in, they destroy the temple, utterly destroy it, and Judaism begins to ask the question, why would God let the temple be destroyed? And they come up with an answer. And the answer they come up with is that we shouldn't have allowed people who worship Jesus to be a part of us. And in 80 AD, they threw Christians out of the synagogue. Appa synagogos. You see that record in the Gospel of John, which preserves that record for us. Threw them out of the synagogue. Jews thrown out of the synagogue. And Matthew wants to say something to those followers of Christ. And the first thing he says is this: you will not find the truth in the stars. I love the stars. I don't know about you. How many of you like looking at the stars? I look at them all the time. Last night I noticed through a kind of a haze, I don't know if anybody saw that, this beautiful moon up there, and Venus right above it. And I was transfixed. I've seen it hundreds of times, one more time, at the beauty of the stars. But Matthew is reminding the people of a couple of things. Don't look to the stars. But your God can control the stars. You're not to look to the stars for truth, but you need to know something about this child born to you is a child of the God who can control the heavenly bodies. That you are not to worship the stars, you're not to worship the Magi, you're not to be in any part of that, but that God can even marshal up his forces to get this idolatrous group to move. God can even speak to people beyond our faith tradition. This is not a God of just Israel. This is a God of the entire world that can move people who do not worship him. This is an attempt to say to the Jews who are thrown out of the synagogue, one greater than Moses is here. Because the cry that went up, and you see Jesus talk about this later in the Gospels, where Jesus himself says to the religious leaders, don't you know one greater than Moses is among you? Here, at the very beginning, Matthew is saying to them, quit looking to Moses. For the Jews who are thrown out of synagogue, began to worry, look back to their tradition, look back to this great prophet, this great religious leader, Moses. He's saying to them, don't you understand that one greater than Moses is right here? You are worshiping one greater than Moses. And the way he does that is, and I encourage you to do this, it's wonderfully theological. Take Matthew, lay it open, do some Bible study. Go back to the story of the birth of Moses. Lay them side by side. Read them, and they almost read line for line, because the writer of Matthew wants his people who are thrown out of the temple to understand something. It's not them looking back to their tradition. It's them looking forward to what God has done in their time. One greater than Moses is here. Gold and frankincense and myrrh. Why those gifts? What's gold stand for? Gold. We should know this stuff. Should roll off. That's what I mean by us not knowing our text. We look at the story, we fall in love with the story, and don't understand that the story is undergirding the message, the meta message of what God wants us to know. What does gold stand for? It stands for king. This is a king. What's myrrh stand for? Frankincense. I'm sorry. Jumped right over. Frankincense. For a priest, it's a libation. That he's saying that this is the King of Kings, that this person is a priest over all priests. And what about myrrh? It's not a casserole. Okay? What is myrrh? Somebody. Stands for death. To speak about what is going to happen to this little child. This is the King of Kings. This is a priest over all priests. And there is death in his future. Death that God intends for you and for me. Okay. So what does that have to do with us? What is it trying to say to us? What does the writer want us to know? The first thing is always choose God, no matter what's going on. And here's where the message, I think, gets real critical. Because the story says the Magi heard from the political power, the one who had control over their lives, the one who could kill them without any worry, the one who could throw them in prison, lock them up, do whatever he wanted to do to them. That ruler, the one who had complete power over their lives, said to them, when you find him, you come back to me. And they have a fundamental choice to make. They hear in a dream not to go there, to go in another way. They have a fundamental choice to make in their time and their place. And their fundamental choice they have to make is, do I listen to the political power who has power over me, life or death? We don't understand that because there isn't any power who has that great a control over us, praise be to God, in the life in which we live in. But that's the power they had who could take their life. They had a choice to make, play it safe, go back to the political power, or to listen to God and take a chance on my life and go a different way. And they went a different way. We have the same choice to make today of who it is we will actually follow. Someone else? Mom was fond of saying, yes, you did that, but if all the rest of them jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? We've all heard that, right? We have choices to make today. Who is it we are going to listen to? Who is it we are going to follow? Is it the powers over us today? Or is it God? Always choose God. We are Christians. We are people of God. That's who we choose. That's who we follow. That's who we order our lives after. That's how we're to treat one another, is the way God has treated us. It has been said that this is the greatest act of civil disobedience in the Bible, and sometimes it calls even that out of us. They were told to follow the political power, and they heard the voice of God and followed God. It's hard in our world. I think it's really hard, perhaps harder than in that time, to discern and to hear the voices. And we are, however, that's what spiritual development is. That's what the whole wisdom tradition tells us, is to listen carefully, closely, and to hear the voice of God in the midst of all that's going on. Because you know what? The truth is here. There are a lot of voices out there. There are a lot of things out there vying for our attention. There are a lot of things in the world which we live in now that weren't even a part of the world when I was a young person, that call us to get involved in this rather than the community of Christ, that say that we will find ourselves in this rather than finding ourselves in the presence of the divine God and who God calls us to be. There are a lot of forces out there, a lot of powers, a lot of things calling on us, drawing us away, but we are in the midst of all of the noise, the cacophony of all that is calling us. We are to be still and know that God is God and listen to God and give our allegiance to God only. Amen.